I don't remember the exact moment I realized something was terribly wrong on Tau Ceti. Not because it was subtle, far from it. The image is burned into me like acid through skin. We had just broken through the upper layers of the atmosphere, the ship rattling from the planet's dense air, when I looked through the viewport and saw them. They weren't ruins. Not at first glance. They were bodies. Dozens, maybe hundreds of them, arranged in stiff, unnatural positions across the barren plain. The reddish light of Tau Ceti made it difficult to tell what I was looking at, but then my eyes adjusted. Their skin was grayish, stretched taut against bone, and threaded with faintly glowing veins like cracks in glass filled with molten light. Some had faces turned toward the sky, mouths frozen open in eternal screams. Others were half buried in the dust, arms extended as if they'd been clawing their way out from underground. But the worst part wasn't their condition. The worst part was that they looked human. I remember my stomach tightening, bile rising in my throat. We hadn't even landed, and already the promise of discovery was rotting in front of us. Captain Kane stood beside me at the observation deck, his jaw locked tight. He didn't say anything. None of us did. What could we say? That we came here to find life and instead found graves. That would have been easy, but these weren't graves. These were warnings. I didn't know it yet, but I just stared at the future. The journey to Tau Ceti had taken us 31 years of ship time, though for Earth it was far longer. The Horizon wasn't the fastest ship ever built, but she was the boldest. A leap across interstellar darkness, crewed by 100 men and women willing to give up everything for the promise of a second home. My name is Daniel Reese, navigator, systems analyst, occasional cynic. I wasn't chosen for charm or courage. I was chosen because I could chart trajectories through chaos and make sense of impossible numbers. The Horizon was more than a ship. It was humanity's gamble that we could outgrow our dying cradle. Earth had been slipping for decades. Storms, famine, heat. Every launch was a coin flip between extinction and survival. Our mission to Tau Ceti wasn't exploration. It was lifeboat building. And I think we all knew, even if we didn't say it, that failure wasn't an option. Captain Elias Kane embodied that certainty. A soldier once, then an explorer. He had the kind of eyes that could see through you, steady and merciless. When he spoke, the crew listened, not because he demanded it, but because you wanted to. You wanted to believe in him. I did, for a while. Our first weeks in the Tau Ceti system were filled with awe. The star itself was dimmer than Sol, casting a deep rust-colored glow across its orbiting worlds. The fourth planet, Tau Ceti, was the one we'd been aiming for. From orbit, it looked scarred, bruised by millennia of wind and weather. Great stretches of desert, broken by jagged canyons and oceans that glittered black under the red sun. But what drew our eyes were the shapes on the surface. Straight lines, angles too precise to be natural. Cities or the bones of them. We descended in shifts. The captain led the first away team, flanked by science officers and security. I stayed aboard, watching the telemetry feed stream across my console. At first, it was just static, dust storms interfering with signals. Then clarity sharpened. Images came through, and that's when I saw the bodies. The official report called them remains. Clinical, detached, but I knew better. These weren't remains. They were monuments. They were positioned too carefully, too deliberately. Every one of them facing either the ruins of the structures or the burning red sky above. Hours later, the captain returned, his face unreadable. He gathered us in the assembly hall, his voice echoing in the sterile chamber. "They're human," he said simply. The silence that followed was absolute. My mind raced, searching for loopholes. He couldn't mean human. Maybe humanoid, something that evolved similarly. But then he pulled up a hollow image. A woman's face, gray with death, eyes clouded but unmistakable. Her jawline, cheekbones, the curve of her lips. She could have been anyone's mother, sister, daughter back home. Except for the faint, glowing tracery that ran across her skin like veins filled with liquid fire. They weren't aliens. They were us. I lay awake that night in my bunk, staring at the faint hum of the ceiling lights. The thought gnawed at me. How? We were supposed to be the first. Humanity's first interstellar step. Unless we weren't. The next day, my unease worsened. We found more of them, living this time. The Seashians, as we came to call them, approached our landing site slowly, cautiously. From a distance, they looked like the bodies we'd found, tall, pale, with those unsettling bioluminescent veins running across their arms and necks. But as they drew closer, I realized just how human they still were. They had our eyes, our mouths, our posture. They even wore clothes, patchwork garments woven from fibers we didn't recognize. One of them, a man taller than anyone in our crew, stepped forward. His skin shimmered faintly in the sun, and when he spoke, the words were broken, but recognizable. "You returned." The way he said it, like an accusation, like a prayer, sent a shiver down my spine. They treated us like kin, like long-lost family. They called us the Forgotten Ones, as though they had been waiting for us to come back for generations. They guided us into the ruins of their city. What we saw there erased the last fragments of doubt. Machines rusted but familiar. Architecture shaped by human hands. Carvings of ships that looked too much like the old colonial designs from Earth's earliest off-world experiments. That was when the truth began to reveal itself. They weren't just like us. They were us. Descendants of a lost colony, one erased from history. Survivors of something called Project Helios. I remember standing in the middle of their broken city, dust in my lungs, their glowing eyes watching us from every corner, and thinking one thought over and over again. What the hell did we come here for? Because exploration was a lie. We weren't the first. We weren't pioneers. We were intruders, returning to a place humanity had already scarred and abandoned. And the Scientians hadn't forgotten. The Scientians called the ruins Estrium. Their word, not ours. At least, that's what it sounded like when spoken through their strangely shaped mouths, elongated jaws, teeth just a shade too sharp, as though centuries of different diets had reshaped them. The sound was melodic, but heavy, like the syllables themselves carried grief. Estrium had once been a city. That much was undeniable. But now, walking its cracked streets, it felt like a mausoleum. The buildings leaned at crooked angles, half buried in reddish dust, carved from stone and metal that had resisted time, but not entirely. Some were etched with geometric patterns I recognized as distinctly human triangles, spirals, fractals like those used in old orbital station designs. And mixed among them were alien motifs, spirals glowing faintly under the red sun, symbols that seemed to twist when I stared too long. I could hear whispers everywhere we walked. Not from the Seashians, they moved silently, their tall frames almost gliding, but from the ruins themselves. Wind funneled through hollow streets, carrying a sound that almost formed words. At night, when I tried to sleep in a makeshift camp we'd built near the city's edge, those whispers slipped through the thin walls of my tent. Sometimes they sounded like voices I knew from the horizon. Sometimes they sounded like my own voice, asking questions I didn't want answered. The Scientians, though, had no fear of Estrium. They treated it as sacred ground. They showed us places they claimed were halls of beginning. Inside, we found decayed consoles and machinery. Some were earthborn, power cells, reactor coils, alloys we could trace to Terra mining. Others were not. Hybrid designs, as if human ingenuity had been spliced with something alien. It was Dr. Run who pieced together the truth. She was one of our historians, though historian was a polite term for conspiracy bloodhound. She'd studied every declassified archive on pre-Exodus colonization, every half-buried whisper of secret projects. One night, she sat us down and explained what she believed. Project Helios, she said, her voice hushed as though afraid the ruins themselves would overhear. It was real. It was an experimental program in the late 21st century. Earth was already choking back then. They wanted to see if humanity could be altered, reshaped, made to thrive on alien worlds instead of forcing alien worlds to fit us. These people, she gestured at the glowing-eyed Seashians watching from the shadows. They're not alien. They're survivors of Earth's experiment. The revelation dropped into my gut like a stone. It explained too much, and yet not enough. Why erase them from history? Why abandon them? Why let their descendants rot on a broken world, becoming something neither human nor alien? The Seashians had answers of their own. At first, their leaders treated us like kin. They welcomed us with feast strange meats that bled glowing ichor, fruits that shimmered faintly when cut open. They shared stories around fires, their voices weaving tales of ancestors who came from the stars in ships of light. They described the Great Leaving, the day their ancestors realized Earth would never return, the day hope rotted into memory. For a time, I almost believed they had forgiven us. They smiled when they spoke of kinship, though the expressions never fully reached their eyes. They let us walk their streets, explore their ruins. One even touched my arm, marveling in my unmarked skin as though it were something holy. But soon I noticed the cracks. At night, I'd wake and find them standing at the edge of camp. Just standing. Dozens of them, motionless, eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Watching. If I made a sound, they didn't move. They just stared until I lay back down, pretending to sleep. Once, I wandered alone into a collapsed chamber on the far edge of a stream. It smelled of rust and decay. As my flashlight swept across the wall, I saw carvings rows of figures etched in deep, deliberate lines. Humans at first, then slowly changing, limbs lengthening, veins glowing, eyes growing large and black. The final carvings didn't look human at all. They looked like the things we'd seen half buried in the dust when we landed. The sound of footsteps behind me made me whirl. Kale was there. I hadn't met him before, but I'd heard his name whispered among both crew and Seashians. He was taller than the others, his veins glowing more brightly, like fire trapped under glass. His eyes locked on me, and in them I saw no warmth, only hunger. "You see it," he said, his voice low, resonant. "You see what we became." I tried to speak, but the words caught in my throat. "They sent us here," he continued. "Promised we would be made strong. Promised we would be the future. But we were abandoned, forgotten, left to rot while Earth fattened itself on other worlds. And now," his gaze swept over me, dissecting, weighing, "you return, to finish what you started." "I don't know what you mean," I said, my voice trembling despite my effort to keep it steady. His smile was thin, humorless. "You will." Then he turned and vanished into the shadows, leaving me with carvings that felt less like history and more like prophecy. After that, the air grew heavier between us and them. What had felt like welcome began to feel like a cage. Everywhere we went, we were shadowed by Seashians. They no longer smiled. They whispered to one another when they thought we couldn't hear. Tools went missing. Small accidents happened in camp food stores, spoiled overnight. Instruments shorted out. Once, one of our engineers nearly suffocated when his suit's oxygen line was cut. Captain Kane held us together with his iron will, but I could see the cracks forming in him too. He spent long hours alone with the Setian leaders, his face tight when he returned. He didn't share what they told him. Not at first. But one night, after another round of sabotage nearly cost us our reactor, he gathered us all. "They know who they are," he said grimly. "They know what was done to them, and they know why we're here. To them, we're not explorers. We're the descendants of the same Earth that abandoned them. In their eyes, we're not saviors. We're betrayers." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. That was when I realized something that's haunted me since. We hadn't found a lost colony. We'd walked straight into a graveyard, and the ghosts were still alive. There's a point where silence becomes more dangerous than words. That was the atmosphere aboard the Horizon during those weeks on Tau Ceti. The Setians no longer greeted us with open arms or guiding hands. They watched, they lingered, and they whispered. You could feel their judgment in the way their glowing eyes followed every move we made. We tried to tell ourselves it was just cultural difference, that maybe suspicion was natural when strangers appeared from the sky. But deep down, all of us knew the truth. Something had shifted, and then Kale made his move. He emerged as their voice, though I suspected he'd always been their leader, biding his time. The first time I saw him address a gathering, the entire colony stood in near-perfect stillness. Hundreds of elongated, glowing-veined bodies gathered in a ruined amphitheater lit by the crimson twilight. Kale stood on the broken dais, his voice carrying with unnatural weight, every word slicing into the air. I didn't understand their language fully, but I didn't need to. His tone was enough. The rise and fall of his voice. The way the crowd leaned in, eyes wide, bodies trembling with some shared fury. The way their whispers rose into a chant that shook dust from the broken walls. Dr. Runn, who'd been struggling to piece together fragments of their speech, stood beside me. Her lips moved, translating as best she could. He says, "You've returned, heirs of betrayal." He says you are. Earth's arrogance made flesh. He says you've come not to embrace us, but to erase us. The chant swelled, echoing through the ruins. The sound drilled into my skull, a rhythm of rage. My chest tightened, and for a moment I thought I could feel something underneath the chant, something deeper like a second voice hiding beneath their cries. A voice that wasn't human at all. When the gathering ended, Cale's eyes found mine across the crowd. He smiled, not warmly, not cruelly, but with the certainty of a man who already knew how the game would end. The sabotage escalated the very next night. We lost oxygen in Sector 12. 3 crews suffocated before we could reroute emergency feeds. One of them, Lieutenant Aurora, clawed at the inside of her visor so violently that she left bloody streaks across the plexi before collapsing. I saw her body afterward. Her veins glowed faintly, as though even in death, the planet was already claiming her. Kane locked down the ship, ordered stricter rotations and patrols, but it didn't help. Doors jammed unexpectedly. Systems overloaded. One engineer swore he saw a Seashian moving through a maintenance crawl space, though by the time security arrived, it was empty. The Seashians denied everything, of course. Their leaders, other than Cale, still spoke words of peace, of unity. But I could see the change in their faces. They weren't pleading anymore. They were waiting for us to crack. I cracked first. One night, unable to sleep, I wandered into the ruined halls near our camp. The air was heavy with dust, and the ruins glowed faintly with some bioluminescent moss. I thought I was alone until I heard them, a cluster of Scientians kneeling in a circle, their hands pressed to the floor. They whispered in a low hum, rhythmic, almost mechanical. Curiosity, or madness, pulled me closer. The floor beneath them was etched with a spiral of symbols that pulsed faintly with red light. Their voices rose, and in the glow I saw it. Shapes shifting in the stone, faces pressing outward as though the wall itself was breathing. Human faces twisted in agony, mouths stretched wide in silent screams. I stumbled back, choking on my breath. One of the Seashians' heads snapped up, their eyes fixed on me, glowing like embers. The others turned in unison, and for a long moment we just stared at one another. Then they smiled, returned. One of them whispered, their voice doubled, as though something else spoke with them. Returned to finish it. I fled. When I told Captain Kane what I'd seen, he didn't look surprised. He just stared at me for a long moment, his jaw tightening, before finally saying, "They're not going to let us leave." And he was right. By then, the horizon was crippled. Too many systems had been tampered with. The Scientians never attacked us outright, but they didn't need to. They were patient. Every day, another accident, another death. The crew grew restless, afraid, paranoid. Some even began whispering that maybe the Scientians were right, that maybe Earth had abandoned them once, and we had no claim to judge them now. The final straw came when Cale himself boarded the horizon. No alarms went off. No defenses triggered. One moment, the ship's corridors were empty. The next, he was there, standing in the assembly hall, his glowing veins pulsing brighter than I'd ever seen. Behind him, a dozen Scientians slipped silently through the corridors, their presence overwhelming, suffocating. Kane confronted him. The two stood face to face, Kane's steel against Cale's fire. I was there, watching from the edge of the hall, heart hammering. "You want revenge," Kane said evenly. "Fine, take it on me. But my crew, your crew are Earth," Cale interrupted. His voice was calm, but the air around him vibrated with restrained fury. "They're the seed of betrayal, just as we are the fruit of abandonment. We are two halves of a wound. and wounds must be closed. For a long moment, I thought Cale would give the signal and they'd slaughter us where we stood. But instead, he turned and left, his followers vanishing into the ship's shadows as silently as they'd come. We all knew it was only a reprieve. That night, Kane gathered us. His face was pale, gaunt, shadows carved deep beneath his eyes. "There's only one option left," he said. His voice was steady, but I could hear the desperation beneath. "The quantum drive." The words dropped like a blade. The quantum drive wasn't meant for biological manipulation. It was a propulsion system, one that bent probability itself to push us between stars. But Kane had a theory, one based on fragments of Project Helios data buried deep in the ruins. If Helios reshaped them, he said, then the same principles can undo it. We can reverse the genetic alterations, bring them back, make them human again. The room erupted. Some shouted that it was madness, that tampering with human DNA on that scale would be butchery. Others argued we had no choice. If we didn't act, Cale would destroy us. I sat in silence, torn apart inside. I kept seeing those carvings in the ruins, the progression from human to other. Could we really just rewind evolution like flipping a switch? Kane silenced the arguments with a single word. Hope. That was what he offered us. Not safety, not certainty, just hope that maybe, if we could pull the Seashians back to their humanity, the cycle of betrayal could end. But in my heart, I couldn't shake the truth. Hope had brought us here, and hope was what was killing us. I don't think any of us slept the night before Kane initiated the procedure. Sleep felt impossible when you knew your captain was about to gamble with the essence of life itself. The Horizon's corridors were silent, too silent. Most of the crew huddled in the mess hall, speaking in whispers, as if raising their voices might draw the Scientians' attention. I wandered the ship's decks aimlessly, tracing the faint hum of the reactors, trying to ignore the thought that maybe I'd never hear them again after tomorrow. When the announcement came, Kane's voice was steady, but I could hear the strain threading through it. All personnel, report to primary observation. Procedure begins at dawn. Dawn. What a strange word to use in orbit above a foreign world, under a blood-red sun. But it fit. This was supposed to be a beginning. For some of us, it would be an ending. The chamber we used for the procedure wasn't meant for this. It was the quantum drive chamber, heart of the Horizon. Normally, it was a place of sterile machinery, rows of conduits feeding into the great core where probability was twisted and folded to move us between stars. Now, Kane had turned it into a kind of crucible. The Seashians came willingly. That was the part that unnerved me most. We expected resistance, screams, violence. But when Kane explained the plan, through halting words and gestures, they didn't run. They didn't fight. They stepped forward in silence, their glowing veins pulsing brighter, as though some instinct drove them toward what was coming. Cale was among them. His eyes locked on Kane, unblinking, unreadable. The first subject was a woman, tall, skeletal, her skin stretched tight against her bones, veins glowing faint blue. She lay on the platform beneath the drive's focusing coils. Kane gave the order, and the chamber filled with a rising whine. Light bent unnaturally, shimmering like heat haze, then collapsed into her body. The scream that tore for her throat was not human. Her back arched, limbs thrashing, as her veins flared blindingly bright. Flesh rippled as though something inside was trying to crawl out. Bones cracked, her face twisted, jaw elongating, then snapping back with a wet crunch. For a moment, I thought she was being torn apart atom by atom, and then it stopped. She collapsed, gasping, trembling. The glow in her veins dimmed to nothing. Her eyes, once luminous, alien, blinked open, and for the first time looked human, truly human. Dr. Wren rushed forward, scanning her vitals. Normal, she whispered, disbelief in her voice. Heart rate, oxygenation, she's human. The room erupted in a storm of voices, some joyous, some horrified. I stood frozen, my heart hammering. We had just watched a woman's body break itself apart and stitch itself back together. And somehow, she had survived. But not all did. The second subject was a man, his veins glowing green. The light engulfed him, his scream sharper, cutting through me like knives. His body twisted, bones snapping, skin splitting as black ichor poured out. His skull collapsed inward, then burst outward, spraying the chamber walls. When the light faded, nothing remained but a twitching mass of meat. I vomited into my hands. The Seashians didn't flinch. They watched calmly, eyes reflecting the glow, as if death was just another possibility they had already accepted. One after another, they stepped forward. Some emerged human again, broken, scarred, but human. Others did not. Their deaths painted the walls, turned the floors slick beneath our boots. By the time we reached the 20th subject, the chamber stank of charred flesh and ozone. Kane's face never changed. His eyes stayed locked on the process, his jaw clenched, his hands steady on the controls. But I could see it in the lines of his face, the weight of every scream carving deeper into him. Then Kale stepped forward. The room seemed to tighten around him. Even the Scientians who had survived, now more human than not, watched with unease. Kale lay on a platform, his glowing veins blazing like molten rivers. His chest rose and fell slowly, deliberately, as though daring the drive to try. The chamber filled with light. Kale didn't scream. His body convulsed, yes, limbs thrashing, spine arching, but no sound came from his throat. His eyes locked on Kane the entire time, unblinking, glowing brighter, brighter, until I thought they'd burst. His flesh rippled, tore, reknit over and over. His veins flickered, fading, then flaring, then fading again. And then silence. The light died. Kale lay still. His veins no longer glowed. His body looked human, more human than any of them. His chest rose slowly, evenly. His eyes opened, and for a heartbeat they were brown. Ordinary. But when his lips curled into a smile, I knew something was wrong. By the end, nearly half of the Seashians who underwent the procedure were restored. The rest were dead. What was left of them sealed away in containment. The chamber was ruined, scorched by impossible forces. The Horizon itself had suffered catastrophic damage. The drive core, Kane admitted, was crippled. We could no longer leave Tau Ceti. We were stranded. Some of the crew called it victory. They looked at the restored Scientians and saw hope, proof that the nightmare could be undone. Others saw only ruin. I couldn't decide which side I was on. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their bodies breaking. I heard the screams. I smelled the blood. And I remembered Kale's smile, the way his eyes lingered on Kane with something that wasn't gratitude, wasn't rage. Something deeper, something patient. At night, when the corridors of the Horizon fell silent, I sometimes thought I could still hear the whine of the drive chamber, echoing through the ship. Sometimes I heard the screams, though faint, distorted, as if still bouncing in the walls. Sometimes I heard whispers in a language that wasn't mine, telling me this was only the beginning. And when I saw Kale walking the corridors again, his veins dark but his eyes brighter than ever, I realized the terrible truth. We hadn't fixed them. We had changed them. And in changing them, we had changed ourselves. I used to believe silence meant safety. A quiet ship, steady systems, the absence of alarms, that was security. But here, on the edge of Tau Ceti, under its dying red sun, silence meant something else. Silence was a warning. Silence was the sound of a future unraveling. The Horizon was broken. The quantum drive was dead, gutted by Kane's gamble. We could still breathe, we could still move, but we could no longer run. Tau Ceti had claimed us the way it had claimed the lost colony centuries ago. We were no longer explorers. We were prisoners. At first, there was relief. Against all odds, some Seashians had been restored. Their veins no longer glowed. Their eyes no longer shimmered with alien light. They looked like us. They were us. They cried when they saw their own hands, when they touched their skin, when they realized the curse of their ancestors had been peeled away. Some even thanked Kane. But it wasn't enough. For everyone who returned, 2 had died screaming. And Kale was something else entirely. He walked the corridors of the Horizon like he owned them. His veins no longer burned, but his presence radiated power, an aura that made even the armed among us step aside. His skin was human again, but his eyes, God, his eyes, held a depth that wasn't. He spoke rarely, but when he did, people listened. Even our crew. I watched hardened officers lower their heads when Kale passed, as though something in him had reached into them and pressed on an old wound. The restored Seashians followed him too, not with fear, not even with reverence, with inevitability. Ken didn't show it, but I knew he felt it too. Every time their eyes met, the room grew colder. They had gambled against one another in the chamber, and though Kane's plan had saved some, I think we both knew Kale had won. Life on Tau Ceti settled into something that looked like survival, but tasted like decay. We established a permanent settlement in Astrium's ruins. Some of us lived aboard the Horizon, its broken hull a reminder of what we had lost. Others moved into the colony's shattered towers, patching them with sheets of alloy and scavenged steel. At night, the red sun dipped low, and the world turned darker than I thought darkness could be. In that blackness, things moved. We told ourselves they were animals, nocturnal predators we hadn't cataloged yet. But sometimes I saw shapes, long limbs, glowing eyes that reminded me of the ones who hadn't survived the reversal. The ones whose bodies had burst and twisted in the chamber. Maybe they hadn't all died. Maybe some had changed into something else. I didn't tell the others. Some truths spread like poison. The fractures between us widened. Some crew argued we should rebuild the drive, even if it took generations, and leave Tau Ceti behind. Others said we had no right, that this world belonged to the Scifians, and we were trespassers twice over. A few, drunk on desperation, whispered of merging with them, taking their altered traits, ensuring survival under the red sun. And then there were Kale's followers. They didn't argue. They didn't shout. They simply moved, spoke, and watched with a unity that unnerved me. Their numbers grew. Not just Seashians, but crew. I saw men and women who once wore Earth's insignia walking with them, speaking in their tongue. Some even began to change, subtly, eyes adjusting to the dim, skin paling under the star's weak light. It didn't take sabotage this time. It didn't take violence. It took whispers and patience and the slow realization that we were outnumbered. Kane tried to hold us together. He gathered us by the fires, speaking of Earth, of duty, of humanity's unbreakable thread. But every time he spoke, I caught Kale watching from the shadows, smiling faintly, as though Kane's words were already fossils. The moment everything broke came without blood, but it was worse than any slaughter. Kale called a gathering. Not just Seashians, not just crew, all of us. Hundreds stood in the amphitheater, the ruins towering around us, the red sun low on the horizon. He stood on the dais, the same spot where I'd first heard his chants, and raised his hands. "You returned," he said in our tongue this time. His voice carried effortlessly, resonating against stone. But you did not return to save. You returned to hide, to claim what you thought was forgotten. But it was not forgotten. We remembered. We endured. And now, so will you. The crowd murmured. Some cheered. Some lowered their heads. I looked at Kane, standing rigid at the edge of the dais, his fists clenched. His jaw trembled, but he didn't speak. Kale's eyes swept the gathering, and for a moment, they landed on me. I felt something inside me recoil, as though his gaze was pulling at threads buried deep in my bones. "You will not leave," Kale said. "Not because your ship is broken, not because your drive is dead, but because you belong here now, just as we belonged. You are us, and we are you. There is no Earth. There is only this." The roar of the crowd drowned out everything. That night, Kane vanished. No one saw him leave. No body was found. Some whispered he'd gone into the ruins, walked into the darkness, and never returned. Others said Kale had claimed him quietly, without spectacle. Me? I think Kane knew the truth long before the rest of us, that he had lost, and that the Horizon's mission had become something else entirely. I stayed. I had no choice. I breathed the air, ate the food, watched the red sun rise and fall. Days blurred into weeks. The restored Seashians intermingled with us, their children carrying both our features and faint traces of glowing veins. The line between them and us dissolved drop by drop, until no one bothered to distinguish anymore. Sometimes I catch myself in a reflection, and I don't recognize what I see. My eyes adjust too quickly to the dark. My skin looks paler than it should. And just once, I thought I saw a faint glow tracing along the vein in my wrist. I told myself it was a trick of the light. Now, as I write this, if writing even matters anymore, I don't know what we are. Are we survivors? Or are we the next phase of Project Helios? Are we reborn? Or are we lost? The silence answers me. The silence of a ship, the silence of Earth, the silence of stars too far away to ever reach. And beneath that silence, I sometimes hear whispers, low, rhythmic, familiar. The same whispers I heard in the ruins when I first stumbled on that circle of Seashians. They tell me what I already know. We are not human. Not anymore. We're something else. And in the silence between stars, we will endure.